Is existentialism necessarily pessimistic? About 25 years ago now, I was at university for the first time, embarking on a degree in biology. 25 years on, I find myself back at university for a second time as a post-grad student on a doctoral program in existential psychotherapy. Quite the contrast from my rationalist, materialist roots. I'm into my second year, and for my research idea, I'm hoping to explore the phenomenological experience of therapists encountering pessimism in their own therapeutic work. My main thrust and motivation for doing this comes from my own outlook in life, which has always tended towards a more existentialist slant and, dare I say, a pessimistic one. If existential thought in its simplest terms is a philosophy concerned with finding self and the meaning of life through free will, choice and personal responsibility, then how is this philosophy sometimes seen as being a pessimistic one? At this point, I'll shed some light onto my own personal choices for being drawn to existentialism and why it might necessarily be seen as being pessimistic. The first aspect that draws me to this philosophy is that there are two sides to it. Existentialism has its more obvious intellectual side, with writers such as Sartre, Heidegger, Kierkegaard and Nietzsche to name but a few, which has to do with the text, the thinkers and the ideas, sometimes expressed in its own specialized vocabulary. More than that, it has a deeper and more subtle side, which has more to do with what I would refer to as an existential sensibility or an existential way of life, from writers such as Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Camus and Nietzsche. In other words, existentialism makes an appeal to my mind, the part which wants to understand life more deeply, and it also appeals to the spiritual aspect of myself which longs to experience life more deeply, and that would be the large part of what draws me to existentialism, in the way that it honours my intellectual curiosity, but also the part of me that wants to feel deeply and powerfully alive. I've come to learn that there are multiple perspectives on the meaning of knowledge, and for me there is an ethical sense to learning, which I believe existentialism has taught me to pursue a how to live question rather than a why to live question. I find taking a rationalist approach to life ends up draining the mytho-poetic side to experience. And then on the other hand, I'm not adhering to any kind of explanation of life that is not rational enough to be intellectually convincing, as those sorts of approaches can end up feeling too metaphysically unreal. In my choosing to explore pessimism as a research idea, I find a second aspect of existentialism that I am more particularly drawn to, in its moments of extraordinary and staggering honesty. I find existential thinkers to be more straight and direct about many aspects of life that are difficult to admit and discuss. Thinkers like Schopenhauer represented Germany's greatest pessimistic philosopher, who Nietzsche greatly admired, but couldn't quite accept his pessimism in the same way. Other notable pessimistic thinkers like Leopardi, Choran, Zapffer, Rousseau, Camus, Beckett, and the list goes on. Take Camus for a moment. He describes the absurdity of life brought about from an irreconcilable clash between the indifference of the universe and our humanly yearning for meaning in it. What it means to be existing in the same indifferent universe. In this way, I'm drawn towards existentialism for its courage to not shy away from the dark side of life when exploring the anxiety and dread that haunts me and the subtle ways that mortality touches me and how that shapes my experiences. I find this honesty illuminating, refreshing and uplifting, as it feels real and much more forthright and direct about the reality of my existence. The third aspect of existentialism that I'm attracted to is that it is a rebellious way of thinking about life. Camus, Sartre, Nietzsche particularly come to mind. In a way, I appreciate existentialism's attempt to seek out a deeper fidelity and a deeper relation to life, irrespective of whether it coincides with what anyone else regards as fashionable. In essence, I am drawn to existentialism because of its strategic irreverence and sense of rebellion. And this is not for its own sake, but for the sake of understanding things more deeply, and therefore living more deeply. I find existentialism has a stark and uncompromising ability to recognize the difficulties and suffering in life. Nietzsche famously coined the phrase a pessimism of strength to distinguish it from Schopenhauer's doom and gloom with no reprisal. Nietzsche does correlate this with suffering, in the sense that it is all embracing of the world as it is, a great liberation through a pessimism of strength which does not sit in judgment of this condition. To a pessimist like me, I view the human condition as existentially unique, and that it is acutely aware of the passage of time, unlike that of animals, which I imagine to be blissfully unaware of their impending demise. And it is this capacity to be time conscious that necessarily leads me to be feeling a quiet dread that I sometimes feel in the wee hours of the night, the dread of knowing that as time passes, so does my diminishing capacity for possibilities, and eventually to death. But to say that our lives are always in the direction of death is not to reduce it to pointlessness, but knowing is simply to set out the parameters of our possibilities yet to come from our yet unexpired existence. Pessimism can be the amber light that warns us to acknowledge our limitations, rather than it being a red light to which we come to a grinding halt against. I see pessimism as a reminder that whatever I possess in one moment is eventually lost in another. I do feel the pain of that loss, since I consciously retain a sense of these things as a past, and my capacity to feel hope or anticipation for the future is neither reprise for this loss. Given that some of my hopes will inevitably be fulfilled in one moment, they are disfulfilled in the next, as they seamlessly slip into the past. So, I will posit that being time-aware is just a bad deal from the perspective of happiness. Pessimist. I wouldn't bother with happiness existing as a solution to a problem, but would rather see myself cultivating the courage to accept the ontological tension that exists between my humanly desires and memories on one hand, and the time-bound existence that manages to destroy it on the other. Nevertheless, having a pessimistic stance doesn't have to necessarily be doom and gloom. It's not about adding up the pains and the pleasures of life when deciding to go on with life or not, as Camus famously posited in his Suicide Question. While pessimistic thinkers like Schopenhauer, Rousseau, Chora and Zapffe might advocate for a kind of retreat from life, others like Camus, Nietzsche, Unamuno and Leopardi end up affirming life. Like Camus, I see humanity in the metaphor of the courageous Sisyphus rolling that damn boulder up the hill for no real purpose, but doing it anyway, and happy doing it too. Well, we would like to think that. And so holding a pessimistic view of my existence, in that without suffering I cannot fully experience the meaning of what it is to be human, is ultimately helping me to see the suffering side of life in a broader way. I hope that we can learn to avoid thinking of pessimism as some psychological disposition linked to depression or contrariness, and like existentialism's honesty about the human condition, acknowledge its character, that of not being unpleasant or undesirable, but perhaps as a dramatic and brave challenge to the way we can orient ourselves to the world.